Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey from my atheist perspective. In this video, we will be covering principle number 3, which is titled Secular Leaps of Faith. But of course, confusingly, that is the chapter title, not the actual third principle. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But first, Pearcey opens this chapter with a discussion of the problem of evil. And she writes about Deborah Mitchell, a mother who wrote an article that went viral a few years ago, wherein she described how she is raising her children without teaching them about God, because she doesn't want them to learn about a supposedly loving God who nonetheless allows all sorts of suffering and cruelty in the world. Well, the author of the article, Deborah Mitchell, rejected the standard Christian answer for the problem of evil, which is that humans are responsible for most of the evil in the world, not God. And instead, she viewed humans and our actions as small parts of a much bigger machine with minimal influence or significance in the big picture of the universe. And to this, Pearcey says, quote, "Is that meant to be an appealing alternative to Christianity? That humans are little machines trapped in a big machine, that their actions are insignificant?" Mitchell claimed that her materialist view leads to humbleness, but it is not humbling. It is dehumanizing. It essentially reduces humans to robots. And she goes on to describe how Mitchell's assessment of humans as being small parts of a big machine isn't true, but it's telling that Pearcey opens with how unappealing it is. She goes for the ego of her readers first, and then she follows up with an outreach to their intellect by trying to explain why it's false. And that's not a bad way to go, honestly, if you want to be persuasive. It's pretty smart, actually. But it doesn't speak well for Pearcey's commitment to unbiased, non-deck-stacking critical thinking that she opens her response to this materialist viewpoint by saying, is this supposed to be appealing? Well, who cares whether it's appealing or not, emotionally appealing? Perhaps it's intellectually appealing because it provides a satisfactory explanation for things. The fact that it's emotionally appealing should be beside the point, should it not? Because just because an answer to a question isn't appealing to us doesn't mean that it's incorrect. It's a little awkward to speak of worldviews in terms of correct and incorrect because they are so open to interpretation and they are so very much based on a given interpretation of a set of facts. So let me just switch to more relative terms like this worldview makes sense or this worldview doesn't make sense. You may adopt a worldview that you don't find appealing or comforting because it makes sense, regardless of how appealing or comforting it is to you. Now, I don't feel this way personally, but I know a few atheists who are not thrilled about being mortal beings living out their lives that they believe will have no impact on the cosmic scale. But they're still atheists, even though they may not find it appealing or comforting. They accept the universe as it is, as they understand it to be, whether it makes them happy or not. And Pearcey asserts that Mitchell's description of humans as small parts in a big machine is false because that would mean that we have no free will. But free will obviously exists because we have morals. No society has ever not had a moral code of some kind. We hold each other and ourselves responsible for our actions, for our choices. So clearly, humans are free moral agents and not robots. But is it not possible for us to be robots who have been programmed to not notice we're robots? Now, I know that sounds like a silly question, but it gets at an important philosophical dilemma, not unlike the problem of other minds. Can you prove that we aren't robots who are programmed to not notice we're robots? Can you prove what we experience as our own free will is truly genuine free will and not an incredibly convincing, all-encompassing illusion? You can't just say, well, we obviously have free will because we have societies with moral codes. no one is arguing otherwise, and no one, or at least almost no one, is suggesting that society shouldn't hold people who seem to be morally aware and mentally competent responsible for their actions. Some are suggesting that what we think we're experiencing when we make choices, when we exercise our free will, is not what is actually happening. Very few, if any, people are seriously suggesting that we should reorganize society on the basis of free will being an illusion. Pearcey insists that any worldview must explain what we know about the world. If it contradicts our experience of the world, then it's an idol-centered worldview, and it must be rejected, because all idol-centered worldviews will inevitably be shown to be invalid. She declares this because, of course, as she mentioned in the previous chapter, they're all reductionist. So for those of you taking your critical thinking lessons from Nancy Pearcey here, don't forget to preemptively define your worldview as the only one that can possibly be correct, and then go about critically evaluating other worldviews which you've already decided you're going to prove invalid somehow before you even started your evaluation. This is the person who wants to teach her fellow Christians how to think critically. Quote, consider the CNN article that went viral, meaning the Mitchell article. It proposed a materialist philosophy that reduces humans to machines determined by material forces. What sticks out of that box? Human freedom. The undeniable fact is that humans do make choices. No, the undeniable fact is that humans seem to make choices. A deterministic view of the universe, I won't say materialistic because you can be a materialist and still believe in free will, doesn't fail to account for human freedom. It accounts for it by proposing a different way of understanding it, by proposing that what we experience as free will and making choices is actually determined by forces beyond our control. It doesn't stick out of the box. It fits in the box. You can still disagree with it. You can still hold a contrary view. But you can't say that it fails to account for human free will. It does. Pearcey goes on to say that she finds it ironic how people who reject Christianity in order to be free from God adopt philosophies that deny the existence of human freedom. I would like to point out that any universe under the authority of an all-knowing and all-powerful God would be necessarily deterministic. If God knows everything that will happen, then we are powerless to do anything other than what God already knows we will do, which means that our free will is just as much of an illusion under Nancy Pearcey's worldview as it is under a materialist, deterministic worldview. After spending a few more pages emphasizing her earlier point that free will must exist because we all feel like we have it, Pearcey comes to the actual third principle of her Romans-based worldview analysis method, and that is principle number 3, test the idol. Does it contradict what we know about the world? Pearcey says that secularists can't even live with secularism, and for evidence she quotes Galen Strawson, who once said in an interview that even though he is a determinist, he has trouble accepting that the universe is actually deterministic, and he has difficulty living with this fact from day to day. If people can't live with the implications of their worldview, Pearcey says, surely that is an indicator that the worldview is untenable. Yes, because if we reach a conclusion, be it scientific or philosophical, that makes us uncomfortable, surely that means the conclusion can't possibly be true, right? That's the way for discovering truth through the scientific method and philosophy. Disregard anything that makes you uncomfortable. Pearcey's basis for evaluating the validity of a worldview is how well it explains what we know to be true about the world. But built into that method is the assumption that our understanding of the world is correct and complete, or at least complete enough to be evaluating the worldview in question. But again, if we're robots who have been programmed to not realize we're robots, the fact that we get very uncomfortable whenever someone suggests that we might actually be robots is not evidence that we aren't robots. I think we might be robots. But that's beside the point. The point is, sometimes philosophy, like science, is able to not only explain things we already know, but allow us to discover things we didn't know before. And sometimes it also shows us that things we thought we knew are actually very different than we thought they were. You can't just reflexively reject any worldview that proposes something that makes you a little uncomfortable. Of course, the suggestion that the universe is deterministic and free will is an illusion makes us uncomfortable. We instinctively value our freedom and individuality, but that doesn't mean deterministic explanations of the world are necessarily false. Pearcey goes on to insist that non-biblical worldviews fail to account for reality as skeptics themselves experience it. But again, this isn't true. If a deterministic worldview proposes that free will is an illusion, then it has accounted for it. You can't counter that with, but we experience having free will, because that's the illusion. You might not find it satisfying. You might not agree with it. You might hold a contrary view, and that's fine. But you cannot honestly say, as Pearcey has said again and again, that determinism fails to account for free will. It does account for it. It says that it is an illusion. Quote, "In What Science Offers the Humanities, Edward Slingerland identifies himself as an unabashed materialist and reductionist. Slingerland argues that Darwinian materialism leads logically to the conclusion that humans are robots, that our sense of having a will or self or consciousness is an illusion. Yet he admits it is an illusion we find impossible to shake. One section in his book is even titled, 'We Are Robots, Designed Not to Believe That We Are Robots.'" Oh, see that? I promise that I haven't read Slingerland's book, and I came up with my robot bit before I read that passage I just quoted, so I am not ripping him off. It's an independent parallel development, like all those planets they visited on Star Trek where the aliens were identical to humans and lived in towns that looked like studio backlots. That's what's going on here. Anyway, according to Pearcey, Slingerland proposes that people learn to live with this contradiction between their lived reality and the true nature of that reality by compartmentalizing, by viewing themselves and other people as both free agents, which is how they feel, and as part of larger systems beyond their control. Pearcey says, quote, "Such compartmentalized thinking is what George Orwell famously called doublethink, and it functions here as a philosophical coping mechanism. When a worldview fails to account for all of reality, what do adherents do? Do they say, 'I guess my theory has been falsified, I'd better toss it out'? Most people do not give up that easily. Instead, they suppress the things that their worldview cannot explain, walling them off into a conceptual area separate from reality, an upper story of useful fictions, wish fulfillment, illusions." You know, if I were a Christian apologist who insisted that their worldview was necessarily the only one that made sense, I'd be a little more careful about accusing people with other worldviews of resorting to useful fictions and wish fulfillment. Or actually, I guess I wouldn't, because I'd be a Christian apologist. But you know what I mean. It's a technical point, but doublethink, as it's generally understood, refers to holding two contradictory propositions to be true without acknowledging or even being aware of the contradiction, or experiencing cognitive dissonance as a result of holding the two conflicting viewpoints. But what Slingerland describes is a way of living with the cognitive dissonance that we experience when we consider that the nature of reality and our experience of our existence might be different from each other, that our experience may be different than how we have come to understand that the nature of reality actually is. And the dissonance comes from our instinctive feelings, from our unshakable sense that things just are a certain way, not from there being two contradictory propositions in conflict. Remember, the propositions are, one, we experience our existence as though we have free will, and two, we don't actually have free will, but rather exist in a deterministic universe. Those two propositions aren't in conflict. Our experience as we live it is in conflict with the second proposition, but that's not the same as saying the two basic propositions are contradictory. If we proposed that we did truly have free will, but that we also existed in a deterministic universe where free will was impossible, then that would be a conflict. And accepting that both of those propositions were true without experiencing any cognitive dissonance would be an example of doublethink. For instance, let's say we believed that the universe was created by an omnipotent and omniscient God who had a divine plan for everything that happens from the origin of the universe to the end of time, and nothing that ever happened deviated from that divine plan in the slightest. But we also believed that human beings had free will and were able to make real, meaningful choices. Now that sounds a lot more like doublethink to me. Pearcey moves from misunderstanding Slingerland to misunderstanding Marvin Minsky, who she quotes as saying that the human brain is a 3-pound computer made of meat, but also saying that we cannot give up the notion that we have free will because the way our brains operate forces us to maintain it even if we know it to be false. Again, I think Pearcey incorrectly labels this as an example of doublethink, and again, she presents it as though Minsky is asking people to accept two contradictory positions as being simultaneously true. Minsky, as quoted, is not saying that we both have and don't have free will. He's saying that we don't have it, but our brains are wired in such a way that we instinctively feel like we do have it. And since most everybody feels that way, it makes no sense to force ourselves to live as though we don't have it when we all instinctively feel like we do have it. This is not an attempt to deny lived experience. This is an attempt to reconcile our lived experience with what may be a fundamental truth that feels incompatible with that experience. Pearcey hits this point 3 more times. Once while citing Saul Smilansky, once again while citing Richard Dawkins, and once again while citing Albert Einstein, all of whom make the same basic point, that determinism means there's no such thing as free will, but we're stuck living as though we do have free will, because what else are we going to do? And Pearcey counters them all with the same counter that she's presented to the others. If the proposition that there is no such thing as free will feels wrong, that must be because it is wrong. And incredibly, Pearcey continues to dwell on this subject for several more pages, likening it to a secular form of mysticism and quoting Francis Schaeffer in order to accuse determinists of affirming truths their worldview cannot rationally explain, which isn't true, as I think I've shown already. Then, attempting to show the nonsensical consequences of a deterministic worldview, Pearcey returns to Slingerland, quoting him as saying that the suggestion that humans are merely robots living out a kind of programming over which we have no control is instinctively repugnant to most people, and that people who don't feel a kind of innate revulsion at the idea that they and other people are merely mechanisms with no will of their own may actually be psychopaths against whom society should be protected. And to this, Pearcey says, quote, "What can we say when someone urges us to adopt a view of humanity that he himself admits is bizarre and repugnant? A view that ought to inspire revulsion, a view so dangerous that when acted upon, it would justify us in labeling people psychopaths and locking them up." In the comments of the previous video to this series, someone pointed out that I had said Nancy Pearcey was being dishonest, and that it was the first time since my series reviewing William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith that I had used the word dishonest to describe the author of the book. And the Craig series, by the way, was the 3rd one that I ever did. This one is my 20th. And it's true that I'm very reluctant to accuse the apologists that I review in this series of willful dishonesty. And there are 2 main reasons for this. The first reason is I think Hanlon's razor is, generally speaking, a solid principle, and so I try not to attribute to malice that which can be explained by neglect or misunderstanding. And second, if I accuse an apologist of being dishonest when they make a given argument, I'm saying that I don't believe that they believe it, that they are willfully saying something that they don't really believe in an attempt to convince their audience that they do believe it, and therefore the audience should believe it as well. And I'm very wary of doing that because I don't know what's truly in their heart. I don't know what's truly in their mind. And just because I think it's a bad idea to assume that someone who doesn't believe something due to the belief itself being too ridiculous or self-evidently false, because what I find to be ridiculous or self-evident may not be so for someone else. So I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, even people who seem to be being just brazenly, outrageously dishonest. And yet I find myself being pulled back again and again to that word dishonest as I make my way through this book. As of this video, we are past the halfway point of the book and of this series. And over again, I have seen Nancy Pearcey present fairly accurate descriptions of non-biblical worldviews, often through quotations of the philosophers and scientists who have espoused them, only to offer responses to those worldviews that seem rooted in basic misunderstandings of them, as though she didn't comprehend the passage she just quoted. How can you continue to insist that the determinists you quote in your book as asking people to adopt a view of humanity that is bizarre and repugnant, or that their worldviews are based on contradictory premises, when it's clear from the bits you yourself have quoted that that's not what they're doing, and that's not true? Is it just ignorance? Is Nancy Pearcey's reading comprehension just that bad? Is it a misunderstanding? Is her judgment clouded by bias? Or is it willful dishonesty? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know with Nancy Pearcey. I didn't know with Ray Comfort, who is coming up in my mind a lot as I go through this book. There's a very Ray Comforty vibe to this. But the truth is, I don't know. And maybe I shouldn't jump to the conclusion that Nancy Pearcey is willfully lying to me, rather than simply not getting it over and over and over again. But whatever is going on, it is extremely frustrating. Here's another little taste of what I mean. Pearcey describes how the method of analyzing non-biblical worldviews set forth by Paul in Romans, her 5-principle method, is so effective because it enables us to show how other worldviews are internally inconsistent. She says, quote, "The strength of this approach is that it shows why worldviews fail on their own terms. It is rarely persuasive to criticize other views from within your own perspective. All that really shows is that those other views disagree with you. Instead, you must step imaginatively inside other perspectives to show from within why they lack explanatory power." Yep. And if you can mischaracterize those other views in ways that work in favor of your argument, make them seem to say things they don't actually say, so that your perspective seems like the only possibly correct and consistent one, then that's even better. But she's not done. Pearcey continues to repeat herself, making the same point about the supposed contradiction between believing free will is an illusion and living as though free will exists yet again, before finally coming to something like an end of it when she says, quote, "Of course, not everyone who accepts materialism or naturalism goes on to accept determinism, but I suggest that's only because they are not as careful to work out the logical outcome of their premises. Other people accept ideas that sound attractive or sophisticated, but do not follow those ideas all the way to their final implications." You don't say. If God knows everything, then he knows everything that we will ever do. If God knows everything that we will ever do, then everything we will ever do is, in some sense, already fixed. We cannot do other than that which God knows we will do. From God's perspective, our lives have been mapped out in every exacting detail from beginning to end already. If the universe is the creation of an omniscient God, then it is necessarily deterministic. And what we experience as free will is an illusion, We aren't actually making choices. We only seem to be making choices when actually what we are doing is the thing we were always going to do. Because God has everything laid out ahead of him from the beginning. Our lives are already predetermined if there is an omnipotent, omniscient God at the head of everything who knows everything that will happen. Nancy Pearcey would probably object to that interpretation of her worldview. But you know, often people accept ideas that sound attractive or sophisticated without following those ideas all the way to their final implications. Next, Pearcey turns to using principle number 3 to examine postmodernism, which is her second favorite target after materialism/determinism. And she particularly goes after the notion that there are no universal truths, that truth is a construct. The truth is a local phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, a subjective phenomenon, rather than an eternal, transcendent fact. Pearcey claims that, as with determinists, postmodernists don't live according to their own worldview. Though they might say that truth is a construct, they behave as though objective truths do exist. They may have thought their keys were on the table, but they still find them to be in their pocket. So that would be the objective reality, contrasted with the mental reality that they had that their keys were on the table. And they compare their internal thoughts with external states of affairs all the time, which means that they're just as concerned with objective reality as everyone else. Again, I think Pearcey is misrepresenting the philosophy she's attempting to refute here. From the perspective of a postmodernist, objective truth either doesn't exist or is inaccessible. Therefore, my keys were in my pocket would be a part of my own subjective experience, but would not be viewed as an objective truth that existed outside of my own mind. If everything I experience is a construct of reality rather than reality itself, then the location of my keys is a part of that, as is my mistaken assumption that my keys were somewhere other than where I eventually found them. Of course, postmodernism fails in Pearcey's mind. It's not Christianity. Only Christianity is a valid worldview for Pearcey because, quote, Christianity explains why truth is not merely a human construction. The world is not a creation of my own mind. It is the handiwork of God. The human mind cannot usurp the Creator's role and function. The biblical concept of creation gives logical grounds to support what humans inescapably conclude by experience from the time we are toddlers. Postmodernist or not, materialist or not, it seems to be an inescapable scientific fact that the world which you experience is a creation of your own mind. We interact with the world using our senses, and the information we gather through those senses is interpreted by our brains. What we see and hear and touch and smell and taste, what we respond to, what we experience is, strictly speaking, not the world itself, but our brain's representation of that world. It is a reconstruction. It is a construction based on sensory data. It's not something our brains completely imagined, at least we don't think it is, but it's still a construct. When we're experiencing the world, what we're actually experiencing is our brain's hopefully pretty accurate simulation of the world. Because we are incapable of knowing anything without our senses and our brains, the world itself is inaccessible to us directly. And that would include God, if God were a part of that world. I've never heard any Christian explain to me how their worldview enables us to know things without relying on our senses and our brains. Pearcey complains that most people with non-biblical worldviews function as both modernists and postmodernists. They live most of their lives as though objective facts exist, but when it comes to religion and ethics, they suddenly become relativistic. And the result of this is that people live lives that are fragmented, not whole, consistent, and coherent. And apparently, A few of those non-biblical folk know this very well. Pearcey relates a story of the time she was approached by a Harvard professor after a talk where she presented much of the same material as contained in this chapter, and the professor said to her that she shouldn't be so hard on scientists and on his fellow professors, saying they know their theories don't explain ordinary life outside the lab, but why throw it in their faces? To Pearcey, this was an amazing admission. She says, quote, "These scientists and philosophers know that their theories do not fit in the real world. In Romans 1, Paul says the testimony of general revelation is knowable by everyone." Was this professor unwittingly confirming what Paul says? Impossible to know, since we're only given one supposed quote from this nameless Harvard professor. And by the way, there's another one for those of you playing apologist trope bingo. But I suspect that the professor didn't mean that the theories worked on by his colleagues are completely irrelevant to the real world, as Pearcey suggests he was saying, or inconsistent with an understanding of the world outside of their labs, but merely that their work is of a sort that isn't immediately relatable to the everyday life of a typical person who isn't a scientist or a philosopher. And that is true of a great deal of science and philosophy. There's a great deal of science and philosophy that attempts to understand and comprehend reality at a fundamental level, but does so in such an esoteric way that it doesn't feel relevant or accessible to everyday folks just living our lives in a typical way. But that doesn't mean that the philosophy or the scientific work is completely irrelevant or invalid or incompatible with the everyday lives of most of us. Only in the mind and the book of a Christian apologist would a professor from a renowned university approach them to declare that science and philosophy are irrelevant and then chide the apologist for daring to point it out. Well, how do philosophers justify living with inconsistent beliefs? Pearcey quotes Yale philosopher Carsten Harries, who explains that people are hardwired to believe certain things as being true as a part of their experience, such as that free will is real, that ourselves are immutable, that moral truths exist, that beliefs, and these are all beliefs which scientific and philosophical investigation have shown to be false, at least in the minds of many people. Pearcey says, quote, "You would think that when people realize they hold inconsistent beliefs, they would look for better ones. As we have seen, however, many scholars entrench themselves even more deeply in their reductionism. To acknowledge the evidence from general revelation would point them toward the biblical God, and so they suppress the evidence." Well, we are nearing the end of this chapter, so I promise this will be the last time I point this out, in this video anyway. But the beliefs in question are not inconsistent. It's not inconsistent to observe that we are naturally compelled to believe in the existence of things like free will and moral truth and a persistent, clearly defined self, but that despite our natural compulsion to believe in them, these things do not actually exist. There may be a conflict between our perceived experiences and the true nature of those experiences. There may be truths about reality and our place in it that are extremely counterintuitive to us given our lived experiences, but that is not the same thing as having a logically contradictory, incoherent worldview. And it is certainly not the same thing as those beliefs, those philosophies that feel counterintuitive to us necessarily being false, which is what Pearcey is arguing. There is nothing incoherent about the statement, we experience free will, but that is an illusion. Free will does not actually exist. The fact that we feel as though we have free will doesn't repudiate that statement. A worldview that proposes free will to be an illusion does not leave it out of the box. It is possible to acknowledge and value our experiences and to propose that the true nature of those experiences is something other than we might naturally think it to be. I'm not saying that you have to be a postmodernist. I'm not saying you have to be a determinist. I'm not even saying that you have to be a materialist. The validity of those philosophies isn't relevant to this discussion. What is relevant is that Pearcey has presented those philosophies, offered objections to them based on significant misunderstandings or mischaracterizations, and ultimately presented nothing by way of a rebuttal more compelling or complex than, "But that just can't be right." She merely asserts that the non-biblical worldviews she's attacking are wrong because they've just got to be. And then she asserts that Christianity is the only viable alternative. But in doing so, she continues to misrepresent the worldviews that she seeks to undermine. On the second to last page of the chapter, she writes that Christianity offers a logical basis for aspects of human experience that secular worldviews can't explain, among them freedom, creativity, love, and personal significance. Whether she is willfully lying or simply ignorant, the fact remains that what she's saying just isn't true. Every secular worldview that she has examined thus far has been able to account for freedom, creativity, love, and personal significance being a part of our experience. Pearcey's problem is that she doesn't like the explanations. They aren't good enough for her. They make her uncomfortable. So she pretends they aren't there. She reaches into the box and tries to pull free will or love out so she can say, see, there's something they couldn't fit into their box. And like any practiced apologists, Pearcey's misdirecting her audience like a veteran stage magician, hoping that while they're focused on how much room there is in the other box, they won't notice that her box is empty. Well, that's it for this chapter of the book. That's it for this video. I will return in the next video in the series to cover the next chapter of the book, which is titled Principle Number 4, Why Worldviews Commit Suicide. I think we can all agree that worldview suicide is a pressing problem. And hopefully Nancy Pearcey can help us to solve that tragic problem as we examine that chapter next week. As always, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you got something out of this, whatever that might be. I hope it is of some use or interest to you. If you did find this to be an interesting or useful video, please do like, share, and subscribe. Please leave a comment if you have anything to say in response to what I have had to say in this video. I suspect that my interpretation of a universe under the authority of an omniscient God being necessarily deterministic might inspire some disagreement and some argument from those of you who are much more well philosophically versed than I am. If so, please have at it. And if you enjoy my work and you enjoy these videos and you would like to help me continue making them and also pay my bills and pay my rent and buy food and stuff, then please consider supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month, which really helps me out more than you could possibly imagine. And if you can afford it and you think I'm worth it and you want to pledge at higher levels, you can pick up some extra perks for going above and beyond. And if you pledge at $5 a month, you not only get yourself a shout out at the end of a Facepalm 5 video that I do, but you also get a sneak peek at future episodes of this series by getting to read the scripts the day before the video goes up. So it's just an extra little incentive for those of you who can afford it and think I'm worth it to pledge at the level of $5 a month or higher. So thank you as always for watching. Thank you for your support in whatever form that support comes. And I will see you in the next video.